Okay, greetings and happy 4th of July. And we'd like to welcome many listeners who are joining us today, both in the United States and internationally, for this Independence Day webinar hosted by the World Socialist Web Site entitled "The Place of the Two American Revolutions, Past, Present, and Future." The American revolutions of 1775 and 1783 and the Civil War of 1861, 1865 rank among the most momentous events in shaping the political, social, and intellectual history of the modern world. The Declaration of Independence, issued on July the 4th, 1776, established the United States on the principle that all men are created equal. This first revolution set into motion socioeconomic and political processes War, the Second American Revolution, which abolished slavery. We have today with us an illustrious group of professors, leading experts in their fields of American history, and I'd like to briefly introduce them now. Joining us from Texas is Victoria Bynum, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at Texas State University. She is the author of The Free State of Jones, Mississippi's Longest Civil War, The Long Shadow of the Civil War, Southern Descent and Its Legacies, and Unruly Women, the Politics of Social and Sexual Control in the Old South, as well as other books and articles focused on the resistance of poor and working class men and women, black and white, against slavery and Jim Crow. Joining us from California is Clay Carson. Carson is a professor of American history at Stanford University, editor of the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers, director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute, and founder of the Liberation Curriculum, an online resource for teachers. He's the author and editor of a number of books and articles, including the autobiography of Martin Luther King and In Struggle, SNCC, SNCC, and the Black Awakening of the 1960s, which won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award in American history. Joining us from Great Britain is Richard Carwardine. Carwardine taught for many years at Sheffield University and at Oxford University, where he served as Rhodes Chair of American History. He is the author of the Lincoln Prize-winning biography, Lincoln, A Life of Purpose and Power, and editor of the volume, The Global Lincoln. He has written extensively on Lincoln and the relationship between religion and antebellum politics and society. Calling in from New York is James Oakes, Distinguished Professor of History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is the author of many books and articles on the crisis of American antebellum society and the Civil War, and is a two-time Lincoln Prize winner for The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and the Triumph of Anti-Slavery Politics, and Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861 to 1865. From Rhode Island, we have Gordon Wood with us, Professor Emeritus of History at Brown University and author of numerous books and articles, including The Creation of the Republic, which won the Bancroft Prize, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the Empire of Liberty, on the early republic, which is part of the Oxford series of American history. My name is Tom Mackaman. I write on history for the World Socialist Web Site, and I'm associate professor of history at King's College in Pennsylvania. And with us is to help me moderate is David North, the editorial board editor of the World Socialist Web Site, and himself the author of numerous books. And we have with us a international audience. As I mentioned earlier, I got a note about an hour ago saying that there were listeners from over 21 countries. We had at least 1,000 people sign up. And so many more are joining now. I'd like to, at this point, turn it over to David for a few introductory remarks. And then I'd like to start a discussion with our historians. And we will also be taking questions live from our audience. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Dave North. I'd like, on behalf of the World Socialist Web Site, first of all, to welcome our distinguished participants in this discussion, and also our audience from all over the world. There are many hundreds of viewers from every continent. And I think this large audience testifies to the enormous interest in the subject of today's discussion, the two American revolutions. And I think it's an interest which is intensified by the fact that these historical events have become a central element in contemporary politics. There is no use pretending that historical issues can be perfectly separated from the present, nor should one want to achieve such a separation. But history, as history, has its claims. And however one may interpret the past, a serious effort should be made to base interpretation on a principled concern for the factual foundation of one's arguments. A so-called version of history that is not grounded in facts, let alone one that is based on a deliberate distortion or outright falsification of the historical record, is of no intellectual value. And worse, such interpretations, to the extent that they come to be accepted as legitimate, may prove to be dangerous. That's proven by the experience of the 20th century. Now, the topic of today's discussion is the place of the two American revolutions in the past, present, and future. The emphasis will be, in a sense, on the past, on examining the historical events and the individuals who played a critical role, first of all, in the context of their own times. All those who are participating as speakers today, I've studied these the period under question, and I think they're all guided by the injunction that the task of a historian is, to some extent, to recreate in thought what was going on in the mind of those he is studying. Now, we will turn to the present in the extent, perhaps, of trying to understand what the present controversy is about, why it has arisen, what it means, and, in a sense, if only briefly in the end, to consider what the implications of how we answer questions about the American past, how these answers may affect not just the future of the United States, but the future of the world. I must admit to concern over the implications of arriving at the conclusion that the world would have been a better place if the American Revolution had been lost and if Abraham Lincoln had never been born. But let's see how this discussion unfolds. And if I may just begin, since this is the 4th of July, I'll first address a question to Gordon Wood, but I hope that this evolves into a discussion and it won't be too formal. But what was the significance of the Declaration of Independence in its time? For whom was it written? What was its purpose? Was it seen as a particularly radical document? How was it understood in the colonies, in the world beyond the colonies? Gordon, you want to start off?
Well, the Declaration in 1776 had none of the importance that it's had for subsequent generations. They did not realize, neither Jefferson nor John Adams or any of the members of the Continental Congress realized how important that declaration would become in time. John Adams later said that if he had known it was going to bring fame to its author or its draftsman, he would have written it himself. So they didn't appreciate, I think, the historical significance of what that document meant. But of course, they knew that it was important because they were announcing to the world that they were now a state in its own right, wanting or asking the world to accept them as an equal state in the world, a United States, a confederation, of course, not all that different, I suppose, from the present day EU, 13 states coming together, announcing their collective interest in becoming a state to a candid world. And the second paragraph, which talks about equality, was conventional wisdom in some sense among enlightened people at the time. Little did they realize how significant, I think, those words would become not too long after, as people picked them up and used them, especially equality. The idea that all men are created equal is, I think, the most powerful force in American life, and maybe in the world as well. And that became a rallying cry for politicians and others in subsequent generations.
Well, I'll ask a follow-up question, and why don't we, maybe Gordon, you could add, and maybe others have something to say on this question as well. What about the Declaration's international impact, its global impact, in its time and soon after its time?
Well, the American Revolution had international implications. Not so much just the Declaration, but the fact that these states were forming independent republics in a world of monarchies. That was big news. And they drew up constitutions. 13 states drew up their constitutions, and those constitutions were translated and discussed, argued about in France, in Germany, in Britain. So the revolution had international implications, and everyone who considered himself enlightened was excited by it. Now, and of course the French as well, and French liberals were terribly excited and really welcomed this republic in a way that they had no awareness of how dangerous that could be for their own monarchy. But that was the feeling. It was an exciting moment in the history of the world. Many people thought that this was a great moment in world history. So I think that Richard Price, the Unitarian minister, a radical, an English radical, thought it was the second most important. This is in 1785, said it was the second most important event in world history. The first, of course, to him was the birth of Christ, but the second most important event was this American Revolution. It was a terribly exciting moment, and of course, remained exciting for many people, Republicans, that is small r, people who wanted to throw off monarchy right up through the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. So the event was a world historical event almost immediately in the eyes of people throughout the Western world.
When, if I might ask, does this document begin to acquire within the newly founded United States itself an increasingly controversial or even explosive character? When does it somehow begin to interact with the issue of slavery, which developed clearly in the early 19th century?
Well, it becomes complicated even in 1776 on the issue of slavery. The Virginians are, many of them are terribly upset by this, and especially their own state constitution, drawn up largely by George Mason. It's the Bill of Rights of the state of Virginia, made similar references to all men being created equal, and that prompted a debate. How do we handle the issue of slaves? Are they included in this all men? And they decided that in Virginia, now we're talking about the Virginia Constitution and the Virginia Bill of Rights, but the words are similar. The sentiments are widely, these are conventional wisdom that's declared in the Declaration. The Virginians decided that this meant people who were in civil society, and the slaves are excluded. That's the way they handled that. The Declaration is not an original document. Jefferson never claimed that he was saying something new. He was repeating what an enlightened people would think. And I think that's the important part. It's already been shown that, I think Pauline Mayer's book on the Declaration showed that at least 80 different declarations were being declared at the same time by various groups, not only the colonies, but special interest groups throughout the colonies were making similar statements. So this is a declaration. This declaration is an expression of the American mind, as Jefferson put it. So slavery is right there, right at the outset. The conflict between all men being created equal and slavery.
Jim, are you trying to?
There we go. Oh, is somebody else trying to talk? Also? Am I, can you hear me?
Go ahead, Vicky. I was going to say something, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was unmuted. I mean, I was muted for a while there when I started
me
talking,
too.
But
Right.
Well, anyway, I wanted to build on what Gordon was saying and talk a little bit about my surprise when I started working on Southern Unionists, that I would end up looking at the revolutionary era to the extent that I did. And one of the things that motivated me to go back much further in time was the fact that I couldn't find good records for the Civil War era, courthouse burnings and that sort of thing, so that many of the antebellum records just weren't there. But there were a lot of colonial records and revolutionary era records that were available elsewhere. And one of the first things that I was noticed and became really fascinated by was when I started to actually trace individual ancestors of my Unionists back in time. They went right back to the regulator movement of North Carolina. And the regulator movement is very much a movement, it's a class-based movement. It precedes the American Revolution. It's 1765 to 71, but it's very much motivated and articulated along the lines of the Enlightenment thought and the very ideas that are leading to the American Revolution. The regulators of North Carolina, that's where my regulators came from, and the North Carolina regulator movement is a much more class-based movement than the South Carolina one. That distinction always needs to be made. But it involved attacks on the upper class, the merchants, planters, lawyers, so-called courthouse rings where power had been consolidated, smaller farmers, or should we say rising farmers. Some of them were small slaveholders, some of them did not own slaves, but they tended to be property owners. They were very much afraid that the American experiment, or the American colony as it still was then, was heading in a direction of just engrossment of wealth by the emerging, or it had been around for quite some time, the tobacco economy, but the emergent plantation economy. And so I found this whole historical legacy or ancestry centered around a class-based movement that was surprisingly similar to the Unionists themselves. And these were basically their ancestors, their grandfathers. And then when I moved into the period of the South, or the era of the frontier, there they were quoting directly from the Declaration of Independence. This would have been between 1805 and 1815. And there they are, they're citing the Declaration of Independence, quoting things like the common rights of mankind, using phrases like "when in the course of human events." And what they're begging for is for the federal government to provide them with courthouses, to provide them with counties that are smaller so that they can supply themselves, get the things they need. They want judges, they want federal judges sent to the frontier. And they're very frustrated with the local elites, the local movers and shakers. And so here I see as I'm developing my own understanding of Unionists during the Civil War, that is Southerners who opposed the Confederacy and many of whom ended up fighting for the Union. Here I'm seeing a long-standing old conflict coming forward. And they are from a class of people who basically came out of indentured servitude in an earlier period of time. another time of great conflict. One of the uprisings that I didn't know about, I think most of us who study history know about Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, which played a major role in the plantation economy moving away from the use of white indentured servants to the use of black slaves. That in itself was preceded by an indentured servants plot that was in 1663 that was put down by the Virginia elite. This was in Virginia. And it's interesting to look at 1663 and see how much it still resembles England. I mean, this was a brutal put down. The heads of these servants who rose up were placed on fences, just like you would be on London Bridge back in the old country. And this only preceded Bacon's Rebellion by 13 years. And there you have, again, an increasingly multiracial uprising or set of conflicts. You have Native Americans, you have black slaves who are not yet that numerous, and you have indentured servants. So this is where the ancestry really begins, is back here in this world of indentured servitude. And just to take it forward again back to the frontier, they end up going out to the frontier. The regulators, for one thing, have to flee. They go over into South Carolina, into the backcountry, and from there, we find them continually moving to the frontier. For one thing, trying to escape the plantations generally means they are always on the move. And taking this, then you see a frontier path to the Civil War in Mississippi, which is where I studied it. And then I also looked at it back in North Carolina, where it takes a bit of a different avenue because you don't have the frontier intervening there. So that's the way in which I discovered that the American Revolution was always prominent in the minds still of Southern Unionists all those years later during the Civil War.
So clearly you could say something, tell a very similar story about abolition in the United States. I think the point Gordon was making about the manifold interpretations of the Declaration of Independence is proven by the various ways different groups invoke it, but almost immediately it is the most powerful justification available to people struggling to abolish slavery, because it is so deeply tied to the founding moment of the United States. And it's virtually impossible for me to imagine any real serious abolition movement without that proclamation of fundamental human equality as its most powerful justification. It's one thing when abolitionists get accused of being fanatics or being anti-American or violating the property rights that are so sacred to the United States. They always had the Declaration of Independence at their disposal, and they cited it all the time. And this was as true of black abolitionists as white abolitionists, as critics of slavery. And the criticism welled up, starting with the English Revolution and the Quakers. But not until the American Revolution do you get a movement, an organized movement to abolish slavery, and it sets in motion that 88-year struggle that culminates in the Civil War. And just to sound, not to get too repetitive, it's hard for me to imagine how that movement could have justified itself. Certainly it's hard to imagine Abraham Lincoln justifying it without constant recourse to the principle of fundamental human equality in the Declaration.
If I could just ask you, how did Lincoln see Jefferson?
Are you talking to me, David? Yeah.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Well, William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, said that Mr. Lincoln hated Thomas Jefferson as a man, as well as a politician. And I think what Herndon meant by that was that Lincoln had no admiration for the agrarian order that Jefferson had championed, or of course the slaveholding class to which he belonged. It may even be that Lincoln had knowledge of some of the rumors that were circulating about Sally Hemings. Um, but Lincoln's view of Jefferson the man is to be separated, I think, from his view of the Declaration of Independence, for which he honored him. This was not just a revolutionary document, it was, as Lincoln put it, an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. And he embalmed it, he said, not just in that document, but it was there to be a stumbling block to tyrants hereafter. And while Lincoln recognized that there was ongoing inequality, that was a necessary part of the human condition, the fact was that the document, the Declaration of Independence, was ensuring a steady progress, or ought to ensure a steady progress towards the, as he put it, the practical equality of all men. He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. And this admiration for the Declaration of Independence is absolutely central to Lincoln's political career between 1854 and 1860. The Declaration of Independence is to be applied, was intended to be applied, regardless of race. And he sees his task in part as reacting to what he saw as the reneging of the white South from a position where it had admired and upheld the Declaration of Independence to one where it said that Jefferson, in other ways right, had got this very badly wrong. And it had become, again, as Lincoln put it, a divisive axiom. We began, Lincoln said, by declaring 80 years ago, all men created equal. And now we come to the other extreme, or the other declaration, that for some men to enslave others is a secret right of self-government. And he also said, I mean, I think it's quite important, particularly in relation to any discussion about Lincoln and race, which I know is a properly, reasonably vexed question. But he said, and I would like to quote directly, he said, let us discard all this quibbling about this race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout the land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. And when Lincoln goes on his way to Washington in 1861, in February of 1861, stands up in the Independence Hall in Philadelphia, he repeats this paean to the Declaration, the central document of the Revolution, central document of American history, the apple of gold, as he put it, in the picture of silver, the apple of gold, the Declaration of Independence in the picture of silver, the Constitution, the document guaranteeing American freedoms. Then there was a period, briefly, in terms of his commitment, lifetime commitment to the Declaration, between 1861 and 1863, when he recognizes the divisive quality of the Declaration of Independence. He seeks to bring public opinion towards the principles of the Declaration, which of course he then does so magnificently at Gettysburg in November of 1863.
I think we shouldn't get too far in this discussion without bringing up Frederick Douglass, because I think that for many people, this weekend is going to be a weekend in which you celebrate the 4th of July, but also the 5th of July, when Frederick Douglass gave his great speech in Rochester, in which he, I think more cogently than perhaps anyone, indicated the lasting importance of that principle of equality that is articulated in the Declaration. And he does it in a way that I think becomes part of African-American rhetoric and history from that point on. And that is that in that speech, he starts by applauding what the founders did.
It seems like Clay Carson's screen is frozen, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. You're back.
Okay.
We heard the first part of what you were saying about the Douglas's 5th of July speech, but we lost about.
And he
Can you hear me
applauded.
now?
He starts by applauding.
If you could just review what he said at that speech, that would be for the
Well,
audience.
I think to summarize it, basically, he takes his audience on an intellectual journey because he knows that his audience is mostly white. He wants to say, I too celebrate the Declaration of Independence. And but then he leads them on to say, have we lived up to that? And has the nation lived up to that? And of course, his answer is, to the slave, what is the 4th of July? And I think, sets the tone for many of the racial reform movements from that time on, because, in a sense, Martin Luther King is doing the same thing. He's saying, in fact, one of the thoughts I had in terms of suggesting the design for the memorial was that Martin Luther King is facing Jefferson, and that he's carrying on a dialogue over the centuries, a symbolic dialogue, the same way Frederick Douglass was, of what is the meaning of this document that you've created, this principle that you've created of equality. And then, of course, in the middle part of the speech, he devastates the reality that this nation has not lived up to those principles, and in language that would be strong in any period. But I think he ends with that notion that it can be made right. It's an interesting speech at the end because it turns toward a kind of optimism that we can make it right. And so I think that that's perhaps one of the ways in which we can view the importance of the Declaration, the importance of what this day means. I personally would like to see every American, perhaps we need a 2-day holiday, one of them on the 4th of July to celebrate the Declaration. On the 5th of July, we critique what has happened, whether or not we've lived up to that Declaration. And I think that educational exercise would be profoundly important. And I hope that maybe on the audience for this talk might quickly do a Google search, find Frederick Douglass's speech, and read it for themselves.
Well, I think that's a really important point, and the discussion brings to mind a quote from the late great historian of slavery, David Bryan Davis, that often comes to mind. He referred to the Declaration of Independence to the abolitionists as their touchstone, their sacred scripture, it gets to I think another really fascinating question that connects all of your work, and certainly Gordon, you raise it as an aspect of the radicalism of the American Revolution itself, but the idea that the revolution raised the dignity of labor, and then in this antebellum world, slavery becomes conspicuous in a way that it hadn't been before. There are a lot of related questions. Clearly, the Democratic Party that emerges in the 1830s and 1840s is a mass party that's dedicated to promoting racism and suppressing that question. So I guess I've kind of put out a question to all of you, and anyone who want to jump in on that.
Would you repeat, I'm sorry, but would you kind of repeat the gist of the main core of your question?
Yeah, the way that the American Revolution, coming out of this world of aristocrats and lords and ladies, and in which labor was degraded and debased. The question is, how is it that now slavery becomes a problem that it hadn't been before? And certainly the historical figure of Abraham Lincoln, of Frederick Douglass, they're very, very much focused on this.
Well, I wanted to say, just in regard to the people that I studied as they emerged from the American Revolution and begin to think of themselves as free white men with certain rights that are guaranteed to them by the Declaration and the Constitution. They know that their freedom and that the difference in their status as opposed to their servant ancestors is dependent on the dispossession of Indians. It's dependent on race-based slavery. Race-based slavery is what took them out of the world of indentured servitude. And so there's a way in which a certain kind of racism there, and I'm talking about in the early 19th century before we get to the abolitionists, the better known abolitionists of the 1830s and 40s. They were already there, of course, at this time, but not as such an organized movement. So they are, I mean, you would say, many would say racist to the core. Of course, slavery exists. That's why they're free. They see it that way. It's a racism born of the class conflict that they have been a part of and exposed to since their ancestors came over. And yet, that very class conflict, they see themselves as free white men because they cannot be slaves. Yet slavery, as they recognize more and more and more, is what enriches the plantation class. And so they become critical of the institution of slavery without necessarily dropping their racism. They certainly don't want to be Black. They don't want to be slaves, but they begin to recognize that this is the big asset. This is the major asset of plantation society. It's the reason why they have to keep taking off from one region, from the Southeast, and moving into the Southwest. And so there's very much a collision course there that really doesn't explode, I think, until the Civil War, where you begin to have really out and out criticism of the institution of slavery. And again, being against the institution of slavery is not the same as not being racist. It just means that you're beginning to develop a sense of your own interest that no longer recognizes slavery as a natural good to society, as something that, as the slaveholders will tell you, God decreed. That argument is developing during this period of time, and it's an extremely important one for the Civil War. And I would just point out that in North Carolina, there was really a movement toward abolitionism, a very unusual movement in the Piedmont of North Carolina because of it being part of the Quaker belt. So you did have an early anti-slavery movement there that had sort of died down as the Quakers left in great numbers, but they get replaced by the Wesleyan Methodists. And so you have Wesleyan Methodist abolitionism in the middle of North Carolina. So this is a question, this is what I see as a trajectory in which criticism of slavery begins to emerge, despite the fact that during the Revolutionary era, we see a great commitment among these ordinary yeoman farmers to taking Indian land and owning a few slaves if they can, or certainly accepting that Black people are slaves.
If I could come back to the first question and both address it, well, to all of you again, but first of all to Gordon, because one of the points you've often made in your writings is you've emphasized how brutal the world of the 18th century really was. In terms of the conditions of the broad mass of people. In fact, you've said relative to what existed in Europe, conditions of Americans were a good deal better. But certainly, of course, not for the slaves, but for what you come to refer to as the middling sort. But having said this, when we speak about the document itself, it came out of a definite intellectual climate, but it certainly didn't reflect, I wouldn't think, the world as it was. It wasn't self-evident that people, it was self-evident only from the standpoint of reason. So what I'm getting at is this document comes to have an absolutely explosive impact because it's stating something, it would appear, that is in such fundamental conflict with the world as it is. The idea that all men are created equal is not, at least in the 18th century, I wouldn't think. I mean, it might have been the latest idea to develop out of the Enlightenment, but it contradicted, and it was revolutionary because it wasn't the way the world was.
That's right. You have to understand the world of the medieval or early modern period was a world that they were revolting against. The so-called Enlightenment is what we're talking about. People became enlightened. It's the beginning of modernity. The basic premise of the Enlightenment is that culture is man-made. Think about that. That is not something that a pre-modern person would agree with. They thought it was all determined. They were all into blood. Suddenly you have an emergence of a view that what we believe, what we think is man-made. We can create it and therefore it can be changed. And suddenly everybody believes in nurture, not nature. To be enlightened is to believe in nurture. And therefore all men can be created equal. Not that all men end up being equal, because there are going to be differences among people, but they are born equal. And therefore education becomes important. And so this is the beginning of the modern world. That's what we mean by the Enlightenment. And that is that's the basic premise of the Declaration. I think what Tom was talking about was earlier in his question was the middle class character that the revolution took on almost immediately in the 1780s, where you have middle class people celebrating work. Work has never been celebrated in the history of the West, going back to the ancient Greeks. To have to work with your hands was despicable and mean and fit only for slaves. Suddenly, white middle-class men are celebrating work. This helped to, I think, contributed to the sectional split to make the South seem even more aberrant, different, and going off in a very different direction from the North, and helped to create the circumstances that led to the Civil War. So all of that is part of this grand story that we have that links these two revolutions. I have no doubt that the Civil War is the North's victory in the Civil War is the culmination of the American Revolution. If the revolutionaries could have looked forward to that and seen that, they would have agreed with that point, that the two are linked, because anti-slavery was part and parcel of the reforms that came out of the revolution. When I think of disestablishment of churches, when you think of public education, plans for public education, legal reform, abolition of entail and primogeniture, these hereditary devices, all of these are linked. Anti-slavery is right in the center of that. And that makes the revolution, it seems to me, a radical movement. And that's what I think gives the anti-slavery, puts the anti-slavery movement, as Jim Oakes just said, at the heart of the revolution.
I want to go back to this question of the disjunction between the words of the Declaration of Independence and the reality, because we're faced with that today. We've always been faced with that. And then it's the question of how do you deal with the people who put forth this extraordinary proposition and lived in a world that didn't come close to abiding by it. And I think Lincoln had the answer to that, and it's that the Declaration of Independence is not a description of reality, it's an aspiration. It's the ideal we hold up and hold ourselves to at our best selves, and he, in a sense, felt the same way, although in a less urgent way than Frederick Douglass did. He could also say, we, as Richard indicated, we started out saying that all men are created equal, and now we're saying that all white men are created equal, and now we're saying all white men that you have to be Catholics don't count either, and pretty soon we're going to be where Russia is if we don't stop this. And he talks all the time about the disjunction between this ideal and the reality of the ideal. So I think hypocrisy is not a particularly helpful way of understanding the fact that the ideal is not a description of reality. I think what makes it revolutionary and subversive is the uses to which various groups of oppressed Americans, women, blacks, workers, always have always clung to that ideal and used it to justify really substantial, even revolutionary transformations that would ideally get us closer in some way to that ideal.
Clay, you've in your last contribution, you stressed the manner in which Frederick Douglass, in so many of his speeches and also in his evaluation of Lincoln, made this contrast between Lincoln. He's not, referring to the slaves, he's not really our president. He understands his historical role, but he always draws this distinction and this, much a dialectic between what Jim was referring to, the aspiration and the reality. How does this theme, and how is this, you might say, this contradiction viewed in the civil rights movement of the 20th century? How did it influence the work of Martin Luther King? How did Coretta Scott King, whom you knew so well, did you ever talk to her about it? And in your own studies, what evaluation do you make of this? How significant was the elucidation of this contradiction in the development of a political movement?
Well, I think I think you know the answer I would give to that. That the movements of the 1960s, in some ways, we could almost parallel King and the movement's relationship to John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson to Frederick Douglass's relationship with Lincoln, in the sense that there's a general sense that all of them would be seen as egalitarian in some sense, inspired by the idea of the Declaration of Independence. But you would see someone like Frederick Douglass in his complicated relationship with Lincoln, trying to say, you have the power. You're the one who is the president. And particularly once we get into the Civil War, we find the two of them, in a sense, working together in some ways the same way that King cooperated with John F. Kennedy at first, and then, of course, after Kennedy's assassination, almost immediately he talks on the phone with Johnson, and they work out this agreement that they will both work for the passage of civil rights legislation. Frederick Douglass basically begins to recruit Black soldiers to fight in the war, to make sure that the stake that Black Americans have in the outcome of the war, he understands how important that is, and in a sense, obviously historical parallels have limited usefulness, but I think both in terms of the way in which Black Americans were related to the Republican Party of Lincoln, in terms of driving it in a certain direction, and then later on, that relationship with the Democratic Party, trying to push it in the direction of greater investment in racial equality, civil rights. So I think that the way I would understand this is that we should understand that in any kind of time of great change, and I think that we're in one right now, we haven't gotten to that yet, but the outcomes are always uncertain. I mean, it could have been that Lincoln, shortly before he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and I know I'm talking to people who probably are more expert than I am, but he considers the notion of allowing the South to keep their slaves for a period of time. And I think he makes it clear that his goal is ultimately the Union. His secondary goal is ending slavery. Only when he understands that you cannot, the Union can't survive half slave and half free, as he says, that he has that firm commitment that leads to the Emancipation Proclamation and all that follows that. So, and again, another parallel would be, at least when you're talking about King and Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy, each of these individuals, Frederick Douglass knows that Lincoln has some aspects of the sense of racial superiority. He says that in some of his speeches. We all know that Kennedy would have preferred to ignore the issue of civil rights. He wanted to focus on foreign policy, and that Johnson was inclined in private to use the N-word sometimes. So we're talking about imperfect people being moved toward a commitment to racial equality. And to me, that's the great drama of American history. How do you take these moments when important changes are going to take place and try to make the best of them during those moments? We can look back and say, what didn't get done during the Civil War and Reconstruction? And those are important questions, but then we also have to make clear what did get done and make it clear that there was progress. And I look upon this in the same way as with respect to the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, is that I was at the March on Washington. I was part of that movement. And I look back now and say, gosh, we accomplished a lot, at least we thought we did. But here we are in the 21st century dealing with similar kinds of problems. Didn't we take care of that? Well, I think that that's a dialogue that goes on throughout American history, that we have great expectations for these moments when reform is possible, when substantive change is possible. And to some extent, those changes are realized, but then there's always that residue that gets left for the next generation to take care of.
Well, I think we'll come back to some of the contemporary issues, and I would just say at this point, I would view that there's a vast, vast difference between Kennedy and Johnson and the broader interests they were defending and Abraham Lincoln, which was a revolutionary period in a genuinely revolutionary period in American history. But I do want to come back again because to this issue of the world of these events themselves. We spoke, and I'd like to address this both to Jim and Richard. What was involved in the Civil War, but what was the environment globally in which this war took place? And perhaps it's somewhat of a lead into the, not trying to lead you, but there were not a small number of individuals who were refugees from the failed German Revolution of 1848-49 who wound up in the Union Army, including, of course, the good friend of Karl Marx, Whittemeyer, became a general, or Karl Schurz. What was the international environment? What was the framework?
Can I come in and say one or two
yes,
things?
Yes, Richard.
And then perhaps Jim would like to follow. I see the key statement of the Civil War was Lincoln's statement in his letter to Horace Greeley. And he said at the end that he wanted to see the emancipation of all men everywhere. The Civil War was not just about preserving the Union. It was about preserving a certain kind of union, a union that would actually be an anti-slavery union. So I think there's this, I think we need to be very careful about seeing a huge disjunction, a huge opposition between saving the Union on the one hand and then making an assault on slavery on the other. It is true that Lincoln was a flawed individual, and I agree with Clay entirely about that, about the way in which all historical figures have, if not feet of clay, at least some element of it can be criticized in a number of ways. But Lincoln was sincere in his belief that the American Union had a special place in world history. The American experiment in representative democracy, mass democracy, albeit only for white males, was unique in history. History was strewn with failed republics, with failed experiments in Republican government. If you allowed South Carolinians to get away with their assault on Fort Sumter, that was the end of the American experiment, on which not just Americans, not just white and black Americans, but the world of progressivism, of socialism, of radicalism, of liberalism, of emergent nationalism, the experiment on which those elements in European society in particular depended. Lincoln said on one occasion, I think it was in New York on his way to Washington in 1861, that the Union was a bit like a ship carrying a cargo, and the ship was only worth saving if the cargo could be saved. And the cargo was the cargo prescribed by the Declaration of Independence and embodied in the Constitution of representative democratic government. And that's why, as you rightly say, David, there were ethnic regiments in the Civil War that had been recruited in Europe, Hungarians, Germans, Irish. Of course, many immigrants, pre-war immigrants, joined up for the Union Army, in part because they wanted to see the salvation of a union, the saving of a union, which would have implications for where they had come from and not just where they are. When Lincoln died, when Lincoln was shot, throughout Europe, there was stunned, weeping adult men and women who felt that what had been taken away from them was the Democrat par excellence, the representation of the new world, the modern world, the world in which it didn't matter to whom you were born. Your status was not ascribed by your bloodline, but what you did yourself, what your qualities were, how you expressed the equality with others that you had been born with. So it's a huge, huge conflict, the American Civil War. It's seen as by not just Americans as Lincoln, of course, called the Union the last best hope of earth, and that the struggle was for a vast future. But right across the world, where there were progressive forces, the American Civil War and the fight for the Union, and of course, particularly once the war becomes a war for emancipation, that perception of the Union and of the war is profoundly important and widely felt. But I say within those progressive forces, and that's one of the reasons why, of course, European conservatives and traditionalists and hierarchs and monarchs are so concerned about the inspiration that the American Civil War is giving to those radical forces.
Could I ask the question, Jim, perhaps you want to take this up. How critical is the figure of Lincoln himself to the Union victory?
Oh, I may not be the right person to answer that. I once gave a talk on in which I explained that I'm not a great man historian. I think Lincoln was significant. As let's say, there is no one who was more significant than Lincoln to the Union victory, but there are so many forces that go into explaining the Lincoln victory. There are so many groups of people who are significant players in that I don't want to say I don't want to focus entirely on Lincoln, despite the fact that I do think he was undoubtedly the single most important person. But as I say, Lincoln sat atop a coalition, and it was a very important coalition, and it was a coalition that understood itself as a struggle between slaveholders and non-slaveholders. And within that coalition, some people were voters and some people were not. The slaveholders were this small group of 400,000 people who exercised disproportionate influence in American public life. And over and against them were Northern Republicans who were anti-slavery and wanted to destroy the slave power, but also Southern whites, the kind that the people Vicky Bynum writes about and has been writing about for so many years, so effectively, but also the slaves. They were understood to be part of this coalition that came together in the context of the Civil War and defeated this reactionary Confederate attempt to do what Richard so eloquently explained, that destroy the only viable republic on the face of the earth, the only one that had managed to make itself seem viable. I think so. One of the things, I don't know if I want to change the subject or not, if it's okay, but it piggybacks off something Richard said. One of the things I've been concerned about is the tendency to erase revolutions from all of human history. This has been going on. This has been going on since I was a young historian, and when first there was no English Revolution. The English revisionists said there was no English Revolution, and then Francois Furet came along and said there was no French Revolution. And we have historians telling us that the Spanish-American revolutions were really just fights among colonial elites that got out of hand and happened to result in the abolition of slavery. Like that. Sheila Fitzpatrick, the great Russian historian, is complaining that there are people now saying there was no Russian Revolution. And of course, we have a historiography that's telling us there was no American Revolution and telling us that the Civil War was not a revolutionary transformation. And I think part of the problem with dealing with the legacy of slavery and what changed and what didn't change is that we're in the midst, we're at the tail end, I hope, of a long train of tendencies to erase revolution. And with it, give us no place to plant our feet in the past to see how things got done, how things got undone, and it worries me. And it worries me that we've lost not only a sense of the radicalism of the American Revolution, but the radical transformation that was the revolutionary transformation that was the Civil War. So the emphasis has been on the continuity rather than the discontinuity. And I think in the process, we have, people like me at least, are being erased from American history. We have no history. There are no anti-racists in American history. We're the first ones. There are no progressive victories that we can study to see what kind of coalition it takes to overthrow something as enormous as the largest, wealthiest slave society on the face of the earth. And so I think it's important on a day like this, not to celebrate revolution, but to understand what a revolution is, and why revolutions are so important, not just in human history, but in American history.
Just to follow up on what Jim has just said, I think it's also a tendency of Americans in particular to see what happened in the United States in isolation from what's happening elsewhere in the world. When we're talking about the democratic revolutions of the late 18th century, you have to also include Haiti and understand how that revolution, which was also in part inspired by Enlightenment ideas, which of course had a very different outcome in the end, because even though the French Revolution and the American Revolution were both motivated by those ideals of egalitarian ideals, both France and the United States tried to stop the revolution in Haiti, basically. And both of them were also empires. And I think it would be very instructive to relate the history of these three revolutions that come out of the Enlightenment and see how they are interrelated. And also, I think that's very instructive in terms of measuring the impact of the question of race, and also the question of the economic questions of what the economic motives of imperialism for both the United States and France, and how that affects their ability to live up to egalitarian ideals. So I hope that maybe one of the results of this would be that we would begin to see that, yes, each of these nations confronted this issue of living up to these ideals, but we also have to look at internationally what was happening. How did this fit into the changes that were going on throughout the world? And unfortunately, I think most Americans don't really pay very much attention to world history. And I think that some of the comments that have already come up of how this is related to the history of many other nations in the world that had revolutionary possibilities during the 18th century.
A lot of very good points have been made, and we're starting to get questions coming in. Speaking of the international significance of these events we're speaking of, someone's just texted me. People are listening from over 72 countries, including in Africa, South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Morocco, Zimbabwe, in South America, Brazil, Peru, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, the Dominican Republic, Asia, China, India, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe, Italy, France, Germany, Russia, Poland, Spain, and Turkey. So there's a lot of interest in American history, and in particular, I would say it's revolutions. One thing that characterizes all of your work is a real sensitivity to history. Clay brought up before the question of contingency, and Jim referred to the fact that the Civil War was this titanic struggle against the richest slave society on the planet. The American Revolution too. I mean, these events involved masses of people. They were convulsive, maybe we could speak a little bit about. David mentioned historicism or presentism. I'm sorry, is an approach to history. What does that mean, Gordon? And why is it that we have to try to take events and people in their time?
Well, I blame John Harvey Robinson. He was a professor at Columbia at the beginning of the 20th century, and he created a new history I'm exaggerating here, but I think the Americans have always, what he wanted was a usable history, a history that is related to the present, and Americans have tended to see that history. I think I'd be interested in what Richard would say about this, but I remember Jack Pohl, a really famous English historian who worked on American history, who always said that Americans don't really appreciate the pastness of the past. They don't see the past as irretrievable in the way Europeans do, that we want our past to be alive and to dwell on to somehow connect up with our present. So that, I think that emphasis tends to make it difficult to separate the past, which is dead and gone, from our living present. And so I think we've always had a tendency towards presentism. Isaiah Berlin made the same comment when he came to the States right after World War II. Presentism is always a danger because you somehow, I think I always like that little phrase that was created by the English novelist, the British novelist, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And I think that's very important for any historian to start out, at least, with that notion, to recognize that they are not us. They are different. They have different problems. But I would like to go back to the point about that many have raised. To me, the Civil War, and I'm not an expert in the Civil War, but I've always thought that the interesting question is not why the South seceded, but why the North cared. And there's where I think you get the clue to what Lincoln, and Richard expressed this so beautifully, Lincoln really articulates for the American people, and maybe the world as well, why the North had to fight to save the Union. And it seems to me they could have easily let the South go. And some people have said, well, that would have been better. Thousands of lives would have been saved, and slavery would have been eventually ended, as it was in Brazil, 20, 30, 50 years later. But for Lincoln, it was too important to let that go. And I think that he becomes important because of his words. And I think Doug Wilson, in his book, Lincoln's Sword, expresses that beautifully, that Lincoln is great because he articulated to us why the North was why the war was worth fighting for.
I want to just go on to this, and I want to know why I asked this question about Lincoln's role, because the point, of course, as a Marxist, we are not advocates of the great man theory of history. And Lincoln, of course, was the focal point, and his day consisted of being confronted with enormous pressures. And he was subjected to immense influences, including, of course, the influence of Frederick Douglass. But the reason why it is an important issue, and it goes, I think, to the issue raised by James, which is a critical question today. And I think it goes to the whole controversy and the implications of the controversy we confront. And that is the removal of revolution from history. And to reinterpret the past in a manner in which we take, in this case, what we're discussing today, two of the greatest revolutionary events in world history. And one turns them into, or they become in a disoriented popular consciousness, events to despise. Of course, all the individuals are imperfect individuals. There's nothing particularly glorious about the personal life of Thomas Jefferson, be that as it may be. He also wrote, of course, under the influence of others and in collaboration with others, arguably the most revolutionary document in world history. But now, what are the implications? Because this, I think, is an extreme form of the danger which, Jim, you're speaking about. What happens when an event, but the American Revolution and the Civil War, loses its claim, its legitimate claim on the conscience, the intellectual life, the political aspirations of the United States and the world. And just to come back, just before this discussion, we had a brief exchange, and I noted a speech or an essay written by C.L.R. James, surprisingly, it might seem, in an obituary of Leon Trotsky, which he wrote in 1940. And he refers to the American Civil War, and he says, there have been events in history and their outcome might not be all that important. No one really cares whether the French or the British gained domination over India. But who won the Civil War is something everybody cares about. It was the fate of mankind, in a sense, hung in the balance. The defeat of the North, had that occurred, would have been a political catastrophe. It would have set mankind back. There would have been yet another defeat suffered by the democratic forces. The implications of Lincoln as the leader as the apex of a movement was recognized by the emerging international communist movement, the First International. And of course, there's the great tribute paid to Lincoln's memory by Marx. But if we go, and as we come to the concluding portion, are you as historians disturbed, and may have different views, by this, the very danger, I think, to which Jim spoke, by the removal and the delegitimizing of revolution? Not just, declaring that these events, frankly, and perhaps saying in extreme form, were bad. I know all things may happen in a demonstration, but the fact that in Boston, or in any part of the country, we have a situation where figures such as Lincoln or Grant, abolitionists, are on the basis of what appears to be an entirely racial interpretation of history, are dismissed and vilified. Is that not dangerous? What are the implications of that? What would happen if we come to see if people come to see the American Revolution, the American Civil War, as essentially racialist conspiracies of no interest to the broad mass of the people? They're deprived of their world historical significance.
David, I see the basis of your concerns, and I share some of them. I think whenever you have a mass movement, and particularly in the present moment where a lot of the leadership is coming from people who are in their teens and 20s, that lack of historical awareness, of course, is not limited to the young, but it might be more evident. And so I think that my attitude toward what is going on at the present moment, including a few acts of vandalism against statues, are part of the tumult that goes with any large social movement. I looking at myself, I started protesting when I was in my teens. I had probably never taken a history class. Maybe in high school, I guess I did, but I think that I'm much more hopeful that sometimes historical learning comes after the activism, and any more than I would look at the tumult that went along with the abolitionist movement. Not everyone in the abolitionist movement was motivated by high political ideals. So my sense of it is like a lot of historical questions, let's wait and see. And it's our job as much as possible to provide the information that young activists should have, provide the perspective that young activists should have. But to overreact to excesses, I think is to me, I would much rather simply point out that these things should be discussed and that people should gain more historical knowledge, but not to overemphasize it, and recognize that this is a new movement that to me is very similar to the sit-ins of the early 1960s. It represents the beginning and not the end.
I'd like to add a few words to that. I agree with Clay very much that we want to be careful not to overreact to the excesses, because they do go with the territory. But I also agree with what he says about how sometimes this is how we learn about history. And so I think it is important to respond to it. One of the problems that I have with popular history in general is the word heroes. I think we use the word heroes far too much, because it does make us feel as though our leaders are past important people, presidents, whatever they are, whoever they are, must be heroes. And again, we're back to that issue of purity. They're not going to be pure. And I was glad, Clay, that you mentioned that not all the abolitionists were inspired by such noble ideals. We have some very flawed people out there among some of the groups that we admire the most. There's no doubt about it. And then the other point I'd like to make historically, just because it's something that might be learned, is the Confederate monuments. Excuse me. The Confederate monuments, of course, the monuments to the Confederacy, to the Confederate leaders, are very different than the monuments that we're talking about here. Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, some of the abolitionists. These are flawed men, but they are all forces in history. And we can all name the incredible revolutionary forces and positive forces. The Confederate monuments are the ultimate falsification of history. They should not be lumped into everybody who ever made a racist remark or worse than that, engaged in racist actions, even while they were trying to involve themselves in positive movements or movements that we recognize as positive. The Confederate monuments are nothing but a lie about the revolutionary character of the Civil War. They turned Black actors into absolute buffoons in the movie The Birth of a Nation. They erased white Southern Unionists altogether, except to occasionally present one or two as just a degraded poor white. So this is the history that I think we can teach, we can present. Of course, there have to be ears there to hear it. And just having said that, I think I do really agree with the point that Clay made, and that hopefully just all this energy and this indignation about the issues that face us today. The pandemic has certainly exposed many of the issues of inequality in our society. We have some people getting very rich off of it. We have some people being forced into situations where they may die from it. And so it's got everybody thinking more about the structure of society, and that's a good thing.
I say that I agree completely that the issue of the statues, of the Confederate statues, is fundamentally different from those other statues for the reasons Vicky mentioned, and a few more of my own. I think I would also say that I worry that the focus on statues is based on a sense that history is driven by personalities. Right? So that the thing that made the Confederate statues different is that they were monuments to the Confederacy. Right? It's one of them is Jefferson Davis, and one of them is Robert E. Lee, and one of them is Stonewall Jackson, but it's the Confederacy that was being monumentalized in those, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's important to understand when we talk about flawed people like Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses Grant and some of the other people who are also coming under attack, is that they, like Jefferson Davis, represented something, and their significance historical significance arises from what they represented. And they represented these revolutionary transformations. And I think one of the hardest things that historians have getting across to students and to the readers in general or population in general. It's the way in which revolutions are always unfinished. Right? So you can always point to the inadequacies of a revolution because, Eric Foner subtitled his great book on Reconstruction, The Unfinished Revolution. If we start from the recognition that all revolutions are unfinished, and as I mentioned earlier about, you can focus on the hypocrisy of people who say all men are created equal when in fact they aren't actually equal. You can focus all you want on the inadequacies or unfinished aspects of a revolution, to the extent that you actually lose sight of what was revolutionary about the revolutions, I think. And that's what concerns me now. And that is, if there's an educational imperative that I feel this moment requires on my part, and maybe on the part of all historians, it is getting that relatively sophisticated point across, that the fact that a revolution doesn't complete or doesn't bring us to the golden age and of goodness and light is not the same thing as saying there wasn't a revolution, and that we shouldn't honor it, or at least acknowledge it.
Richard, would you like to address this issue?
I think you're still muted, Richard.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yes, I was about to say, from the remoteness of the UK, I do follow, well, of course we have our own issue of statues here, but I've been following the events in the United States with close attention. I agree with Clay about the educative possibilities that moments of change provide. I've been quite heartened, and it's a pretty gloomy, there are aspects within the Black Lives Matter movement which are very heartening, let me say that. I've been particularly heartened by as I understand it, the discussion that's been going on in Washington over the Lincoln Emancipation statue unveiled in 1876, with the dialogue between I think the Lincoln group of DC and those who were calling for the removal of the statue, which I think is bringing out the significance of Frederick Douglass in the erection of that statue, and the speech that he made, which is a powerful evaluation of Lincoln and Lincoln's role, making very plain that Lincoln was imperfect, but indicating too that there was something to be honored. My own solution to statues is not to pull them down, but to give them good company. I'd love to see a statue of Frederick Douglass going up next to the Emancipation statue in DC. At the outset, David mentioned the fact that Winston Churchill is in the company of Abraham Lincoln, which I think is probably to Churchill's benefit. But he's also in the company of Gandhi. What you put next to statues gives a context. And that seems to be a much more constructive way of dealing with statues than to pull them down.
Well, we're coming just about now to the conclusion. Let me, if I can offer a few words on this. And speaking to the points made by Clay, of course, we come at it from a different standpoint. I'm involved in revolutionary politics and Marxist politics in the education of the working class. And the issue of historical truth is of enormous importance. And historical debates, though you are academics and professional scholars, frankly, as we all know, there has been not a small element of falsification involved. In fact, it's played a major role. I mean, the claim was made, and very powerful political forces are involved in this. Let's not ignore the fact, as we come to the conclusion of this discussion, that the New York Times has been promoting a version of history which essentially claims that the American Revolution should not have occurred. The wrong side won. And there has been an approach to history in which not only has revolution been removed, or associated with the removal of revolution, has been the complete removal in a serious way of class conflict. And that then leads to a situation in which developments, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, are being viewed in a entirely racial prism and not investigating class forces. The socialist movement has always seen the importance of identifying the immensely progressive character of the American Revolution and the Civil War, not from the standpoint of creating a fictional narrative, because they were, in fact, we would not be here if they hadn't done what they did. The American Revolution of 1776 to 1783 is, I think, as contributions here have been clear, it's the beginning of the end of slavery. I just want to make one final point about it. One loses sense of time. We can look back in the past and we see, 1783 and 1865 may appear to be very distant. But in fact, the distance which was separating the inauguration of Washington, for example, in 1789, and the inauguration of Lincoln is the distance separating us today from the year Harry Truman was inaugurated. It wasn't that long a period ago. And the famous 77 years ago, well, from where we are today, that's 1933. Imagine America being formed in 1933, and since 1930, the year Roosevelt was inaugurated, and here we are at a point in which what was created was now breaking up. So this, I think it's important that precisely in a period of heightened political activity against the background of an immense global crisis, that the issue of historical truth assumes an enormous importance. And the version of history which surrounds the attack on statues such as those of abolitionists or Lincoln, Jefferson, it is connected with a brand of politics which has removed class. It has taken figures out of their historical context, and I think is in danger of, and this is perhaps just the last question. I really would like to pose this question as we come to a conclusion and give all of you, what does it mean? Because for the future, if this revision, and it is a profound revision of historical understanding, not just a matter of interpretation, if we come to view, or students are given a curriculum in which epical events, if I can use that term, of the American Revolution and all that it led to, the Civil War, come to be seen as events which are not critical moments in the advance of mankind, but merely or primarily reactionary, moments of the suppression of the African American people. What does it mean for American history? What does it mean for world history? After all, this is not the only country in which there exists racial or ethnic divisions. This is stirred up all over the world. We've seen Yugoslavia, the way in which countries are torn apart through the utilization of racial or tribal or ethnic or religious politics. So I think we should be, perhaps some of you might feel, oh, this is too much of an exaggeration, or let's give it time. But I think that historians should be concerned. And this is a time to clarify and to not adapt to the lack of education but to see the need to really fight for historical truth, and that is a big challenge. I'm sure you all are working in an environment which has become highly charged, and it's become very difficult to speak about historical events with the necessary objectivity. It has consequences. I just want to make a point. We have a very, very large audience, but I think it should be said that Reddit banned our advertisement of this meeting. They banned it and removed it. What is being Reddit? Reddit. And I must say, I just finally, I'm of course really grateful and pleased that you have come forward to participate in this. But why is there not many such gatherings taking place today? Why is this type of forthright discussion of the revolutionary character of the revolution, where is it taking place? So this, I just hope that this conversation is one which really develops, and that those who are watching are encouraged, and particularly those who are academics are encouraged to really come forward and deal with these issues very, very clearly and without concern of unprincipled attack. Well, I probably have said too much that I should have said. I gave a speech, but forgive me, I'm in politics. But let me ask you, I violated what I did, but let me ask you, from your standpoint.
I'm trying to respond.
Okay, go ahead, Clay.
Well, I agree with your concern. And I think that we wouldn't be having this discussion if not be in terms of the reaction to the New York Times series. I think all of us were in some ways engaged in that. My main concern was that an institution as powerful as the New York Times should have consulted with some of the people I see on the screen. That the problem was that it was not well informed to begin with. But I think one of your concerns, which I think is very serious, and that is that we are in a stage where it is going to be our job to try to integrate all of the thought about race and gender in particular that has developed over the last 40 years into our conceptions of history. Sometimes that has been, I would say, all of these ideas have been weakened by perhaps overemphasizing the role of race and gender in certain aspects of history, or simply concentrating to the exclusion of other factors. But I think it is, all of us are part of that generation of scholars who began our careers right perhaps at the time when the women's liberation movement was flowering in this country, and a lot of the modern feminist thought, at a time when Black historical perspectives were also flourishing, and some of them raised to the exclusion of class. I think it has been our task through our lifetimes, and when I'm looking at James, looking at everybody, Vicky, all of us have really attempted to bring all of these factors together in terms of our analysis. Now, the fact that we either have gray hair or no hair might mean that we are not necessarily representative of a new generation, but I do think that is part of the process. That when you come into a discussion and say something has been left out, you might emphasize that to the exclusion of what was already there. And I think that that's perhaps one of the tasks of our generation and the generation coming up, my students. That's what they are engaged in doing, of trying to bring together these different perspectives and hopefully coming to a conclusion that it will be a critique of Marx. It'll be a critique of C.L.R. James. It'll be a critique of all of the great thought, but it's also building on that thought. And I think that the revolutionary potential is always going to be limited by the limited perspectives, ideological perspective of the participants in a movement, whether it's the anti-slavery movement, the civil rights struggle. Everybody is I think, part of this process of learning how to interpret their own movement and how to place it in a historical context. I might be an over-optimist, David, and you might be very well placed to express that your concern. And I think one of the things that will happen after this discussion is that people watching this will make their own decisions about how to move forward in a progressive way toward another revolutionary moment in history. And hopefully, and it's not going to result in a perfect world, but a better world.
Well, I'll just say too. I don't know if we need to be winding down. I should say that we did get a lot of questions, and we didn't really get to those questions. But I think we'll to our viewers we'll review those questions. And we'll make sure that we do our best to answer them. I thought it's been a really fascinating discussion, and I think that the views, the historical viewpoints reflected, the discussion of the present. It's been carried on in a really serious way, and the understanding the point that Jim made about the importance of these revolutions in history. I don't think it's going to be they're not going to be eradicated. The significance of the American Revolution and the Civil War are reflected in the fact that we're here and we're having this discussion, and we have so many people who are listening in. I'll thank everyone now for attending. If I don't get another chance, I'm sure we'll be in touch. If others wanted to make points on the questions that David raised, please do so.
I just wanted to say that, in regard to what David said, I agree that it does seem as though class is less and less being emphasized in history. And I also, as Clay said, I began at the same time he did as somebody who was a race, class, and gender scholar. And it was a very exciting time back when I began to research and write about those issues. And racial and sexual discriminations of all sorts are very well documented examples of failures in American history. But what I learned in my own work, where I actually was not planning to move into Southern Unionism, but there it was before me, was that really those very issues which are so important today and are being discussed a great deal today, they must be studied, I think, within the well-documented, equally well-documented class disparities that really present us today with an American nightmare of inequality. I mean, I really think that's what we're living in right now. And again, to return to the pandemic, what the pandemic has exposed, that we have such an unequal society. And we know that racism and racism is an incredibly important part of that. But we need to also recognize the issue of class. It's just absolutely crucial. It can't even be separated from the issue of racism.
I agree with that. I think, and I guess I'm another one of those who came up around the same time. And The title of my first book was a history of slaveholders called The Ruling Race, in which I attempted to put ruling class and racial sense, the racial sense that they had of the racial basis of their class power was together. I wouldn't do it the same way now, but it's the same question. And I do worry that we have become less and less concerned with class questions, and that there is a sense in which those who study race or think primarily in terms of race don't want to hear about class, instead of wanting to figure out how the two interact with one another, or how race, class, and gender interact with one another. There's a kind of circle the wagons, and this is the way I think, and you're just a class reductionist, and those kinds of things. So I'm afraid I'm a bit less optimistic than Clay is about the possibilities we're facing. But then, you know, I live looking forward with no knowledge of what's going to happen, and who knows what's going to happen. Maybe it will turn out to be another moment like the sit-ins, lunch counters. Maybe it won't, but I hope he's right. But I'm a bit less optimistic than he is, precisely because of the issue that David raised, that we are turning away from the notion that revolutions achieve major transformations, and that understanding what they achieve. Let me give you one example, because I've been thinking about this. One of the Civil War didn't simply overthrow the slaveholding class and transform the whole labor system of the South. It transformed necessarily the kind of politics to have in this new situation. So nobody ever thought about a 14th Amendment that would give civil rights to the slaves, because that wasn't on the issue. It becomes an issue when emancipation has happened. Right? Another issue that comes up because of emancipation that wasn't there and couldn't be there as long as 95% of the African Americans were enslaved is land redistribution. And I think understanding that the redistribution of wealth was thrown right into the center of American politics by emancipation is an important precedent for us to understand and to grasp, and to see why that failed when other aspects of the revolutionary transformation did not fail. But to understand also that the issue wasn't there until emancipation happened, right? So the politics we have now have to start from a recognition that the entire class structure of the United States and of the South was radically overturned by the Civil War, and an entirely new kind of politics was brought into play by that transformation, and the kind of politics that is actually closer to the kind of politics we have now than was the politics of slavery and anti-slavery.
If I might say, and bring this to conclusion, I believe that this discussion itself and the participation of such a distinguished group of historians who are, and I don't mean this as callow flattery, but who have in all their work exemplified a real effort to have their work guided by a search for truth and understanding, that in itself is a cause of great optimism. And I think that what we should take from this and from the audience which has participated is an awareness that there exists a profound change is underway, something new is emerging, that revolution and truth, two elements of reality which are so profoundly interconnected. It was Trotsky who said, revolution speaks the truth. It calls things by their right name. And I think that the discussion here today is just is the beginning, but it's also a reflection of a far broader process. Let us not forget we shouldn't forget that such an event as we're now passing through is setting masses of people into motion. And from that standpoint, our own discussion must be seen as a reflection of a profound change in which coming from different tendencies, different backgrounds, different perhaps intellectual traditions. Great historical questions are forcing their way to the surface. And I think we all can take heart from this and be very optimistic. I think this has been a wonderful way to celebrate what they used to call the glorious Fourth. It lives on. Such events leave deep, deep marks in the consciousness of mankind. Here we are talking about the Revolution, about Abraham Lincoln, about Frederick Douglass, about individuals who were themselves part of this immense movement which transformed world history. And I think we are at a moment in which history is taking a very, very sudden and unexpected turn. It's not, we interpret it, but great events are taking place among masses of people. We can be, I believe, confident in that. So then, again, thank you all for participating. You all are welcome to participate and send your articles or essays to the World Socialist website. And I hope that we can find ways of continuing this discussion, broadening it, bringing more scholars, students into this process. It would be immensely important, this has to be a critical beginning. It's not a conclusion. So thank you very, very much. And I want to thank our audience for their participation. I'm sorry we couldn't get to your question. Please be aware that there are always technical problems. We're in different places, and so it's hard to follow who's asking what question and to reply. But we do appreciate greatly your involvement. Send your comments in, and we will try to publish the questions and respond to many of them. Thank you very much. Tom, thank you very much for the moderation.
Thank you.
Happy 4th.
Thank you for having me here. I really enjoyed this forum and meeting all of you.
Remember tomorrow. Celebrate that too.
Definitely.